Eat an apple a day on going to bed, and you'll keep the doctor from earning his bread, as the saying originally goes, though I'm sure we're all a lot more familiar with an apple a day keeps the doctor away. This 1866 saying heralds the idea that eating apples helps maintain good health, and a good thing too, because Upper Canada sure had a lot of them. By 1868, $30,000 of fresh fruit, most of which were apples, was being exported from Ontario. Welcome to the Backwoods Kitchen. I'm your host, Holly Benison, and on today's episode, I'll be preparing a batch of apples to keep through the winter, using the preserved apples recipe from the Female Emigrant's Guide. Apples have been cultivated in Canada since as early as 1633 in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. Well before that, however, was the cultivation of the wild apple, or crab apple, by Indigenous peoples across Canada in the United States, which is actually the only apple species native to North America. From the east to the west coast, crab apples were part of the culinary culture of hundreds of Indigenous nations. One wedding dowry from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation on the west coast boasted 10 cedar boxes filled with preserved crab apples and 5 with oil to serve them with. Nations maintained crabapple orchards near settlements, which were an important aspect of Indigenous agriculture pre-contact. After European settlement, many of these orchards were targeted across North America, flagged for either destruction or absorption through settler colonialism. While this recipe calls specifically for good boiling apples, the last sentence states that the humble crabapple would also do well with this type of preservation method. Preserving food for the winter was an important activity that likely would have dominated the day-to-day thoughts of anyone living without access to a grocery store, especially towards October and the harvest season. Candying was just one method, but other methods such as drying apple slices on a fire, packing in bran, sand, or sawdust, or covering slices in chalk and coating them with beeswax, tallow, or rosin were also methods of preservation. Trail discusses the practices of apple paring bees, where young men and maidens gathered at a chosen house and prepared bushels of apples for drying and winter consumption. Today I'm using Gala apples, but a more historical choice might be the Macintosh apple, which are now recognized as Canada's national apple. John Macintosh discovered this strain of apple on his property in 1811, and with the help of his son began grafting the strain to other trees in his orchard, resulting in widespread popularity before formally entering commercial production in the 1870s. The quantity of sugar depends on how long you would like to keep the apples preserved. Trail notes that for everyday use, half of the quantity of sugar is sufficient. The next part of the recipe would really rely on personal taste preferences as well as what flavors you had available. Trail suggests the essence of lemon, lemon peel, cloves, or ginger as acceptable additions. I had some essence of lemon on hand and some dried ginger, so I'll be using those to add some flavor to my preserve. As always, exert safe and tested preserving and canning methods when preparing food for shelf stability. I have not tested this recipe for long-term preservation and intend to consume the finished product in a relatively short time frame. The original recipe says, boil till the apples are tender and look clear, and I've interpreted this by how fork tender they are as well as look. So I may have set the crock aside, but I did set some for myself to give it a taste. You can really see what she means by fork tender, pretty obvious, but clear. The apples themselves have kind of become a bit more translucent, which I think is really fascinating, and that's just a result of boiling them in the sugar for so long. So, without further ado, really good. If you don't like molasses, the brown sugar basically it tastes a lot like molasses. It's very sweet, which makes sense because you're using sugar as a preservative. But it's really the molasses flavor that hit me the most. I don't do canning, I don't really do preserving, so these are gonna be eaten quite soon. So I cannot verify that this will last quite as long as she says they will in the guide, but certainly try them if you just want a little side thing to add to your desserts on top of ice cream warmed up. That would be very nice. Cheers to another successful taste test, and I hope you'll join me again next episode.